Mike Bohn here in Cleveland with Luke Thomas, and we are going to preview this Tyron Woodley Jake Paul fight. Goes down Sunday night, man. It's been an interesting week so far. I guess just want your thoughts on what happened yesterday. Do you think this changes the complexion of the fight at all? I was kind of right there in the middle of that whole scene where the guy was heckling Tyron Woodley's mom right behind me, and then it just kind of evolved into madness. What did you just think of everything that happened there?
It seemed the conflict seemed sort of inevitable in some ways because Jake Paul had a giant entourage, and they were all dressed in orange and and whatnot. I mean, the war of words here in this fight has not been unusual in this relative to other sort of combat sports fights we've been covering of late. But I don't know. It seemed to as the days get closer, I've noticed it's getting a little bit more insulting, a little bit more dismissive of Tyron. And Tyron Woodley's mom is like the most liked person maybe in all of MMA. Heckling her seems like, maybe not the thing to do, but I don't really think it changes the fight. I think the fight is weird on its own. It doesn't really need that. And I know some people think that yesterday was staged. I don't think so, but I do think that people were a little bit on edge more than normal and sort of contributed to some of the behavior that we saw. But the fight itself it's going to be won or lost, not even necessarily on ability. I do think obviously that will play some role for sure, but the amount of unknowns between these two and the amount, in this context anyway, and then the ways in which that can manifest itself over the course of, I don't think it'll go 8 rounds, but that's a lot of time for it to manifest itself. Yesterday was interesting and kind of fun and a little silly. Not that fun for Tyron, but I don't think it plays much of a role.
Yeah, and it's only built up the fight even more. You look at the views on videos, everything like that. There's a PFL event, there's a UFC event this week, and it's just incomparable, the amount of anticipation and public interest it feels like.
I noticed that too. So yesterday, after everything was over, we went and got lunch, and I was looking at my phone and the Sports Center, and everything on my Instagram feed was just constantly regurgitating this. So again, I know a lot of people were like, "Oh, it was staged." I don't know. You were there, right? It didn't feel completely staged, but I do think that everyone was a little bit on edge about it, and so it'll help sell. Yeah.
I don't think it was staged. I was right there. I saw the look in Tyron Woodley's sister's eyes. I saw the look in his eyes. It was scary. It was a scary scene right there.
You can see it play back. Tyron Woodley's sister, who I'd never seen before, she got in one of the Jake Paul camp's faces, one of the guys there, and dude, she was not mincing words at all. So tough family.
Yeah, pretty interesting. Who do you think there's more unknowns about going into this particular context? We've seen a couple Jake Paul boxing fights. I was there for the Ben Askren fight, but there's nothing really happening there. He hasn't been through any adversity. He hasn't had to dig deep into the bag of his skill set and all that stuff. And then Tyron Woodley, I guess a more known combat sports commodity, but not in the boxing realm.
There's certainly much more unknowns about Tyron. Don't get me wrong, there are plenty of unknowns about Jake Paul. And again, what does he look like in the 4th round? What happens if he gets hurt and he has to get up off the canvas? In that sense, Tyron has more. But dude, going from MMA to boxing, and it's your first time. There are more knowns about Tyron insofar as competitive ability or just competitive mindset, competitive experience. We have a broad library of things to look at, just none from this context. And listen, I think Jake picked Tyron for a reason. Now, maybe that was a mistake, maybe it wasn't, but they kind of probably liked what they saw, in addition to not just what the tape showed them in terms of those last 4 fights, but Tyron knows how to promote a fight and everything like that. So to me, it's like this is very much. And we made this point on the show earlier. Brian and I did, my co-host for a podcast, Morning Kombat, Brian Campbell. But it was that a guy like Tyron has, yes, he has used boxing in his career, but in a very limited, relative to pure boxing, in a very limited, narrow way, with a lot of completely different setups and different gloves and different ranges. Jake Paul has really, whatever else you want to say about him, has only ever done that. He's only ever done this context at a very low level, at a very minimal level. It's still a lot more than Tyron in this particular context. So I think a lot of the stuff about Tyron's library and the fact that he was a very good and very decorated champion, that is more being used as a way to sell the authenticity of a win should Jake Paul emerge victorious. I think it has less implications for how the fight might actually go.
How stupid do you think the narrative is that Tyron Woodley's, either going to throw this fight or, all those things? Like, he has a rematch clause in the contract. It's his incentive to win this fight so he can get this payday twice. So, like, to me, that just seems like one of the dumbest things you could bring up when it comes to it.
Are people saying this?
I mean, you see it everywhere. I guess it depends how much stock you want to put into it. I mean, you'll see that in pretty much everything. It's just like the people who say yesterday was staged. They'll, say, or Ben Askren took a dive or whatever.
I'll say this: the further, like, whatever you imagine the highest level of fighting to be, the most professional with the best fighters. There's always going to be scrutiny, particularly in boxing, around judging and that kind of a thing. There's always like this element of to what extent is what you're watching above board. You get that in MMA too. And the further you get from that, right, because this is not championship level boxing, it's not even close. The further you get from that and the more weird the fight gets, and let's be honest, the fight's weird. It's fucking weird, pardon me. It's weird. It naturally raises suspicions. Like, I remember when we were doing all of those, as a media, when we were covering all of those Bellator fights, when they would have like Tito versus another old guy. And people were always like, all of these are thrown. Like, they're not thrown, but I understand why some people immediately go to that, because the matchups feel a little weird. It all feels like it's not for anything other than cheap attention, and if it is, then why wouldn't you be doing some other things that are not necessarily what you're supposed to be? But no, like, Tyron's got every, and also, like, he appears to be in great shape. And dude, like, if I had to ask you, who's having fun this week, Jake Paul or Tyron? Tyron looks like he's having zero fun. Like, he is dialed in competitively. Jake's kind of, I mean, he's dialed in too, but he's taking it a little bit lighter, I think. And so, no, I don't. I mean, that I get why that happens, but no.
And another thing I want to ask you, the broader general thing around this fight. People criticize us as media for like being here and covering this and posting things over, Twitter, Instagram, as comparatively to say like the UFC or PFL when we're MMA journalists, quote unquote. I know you're part of the Showtime family and, it's part of the obligation to be here. But what do you make of these criticisms? I mean, to me, the people out there are watching this stuff more. They're clicking on it more. It's our incentive and motivation to cover this because you're clearly showing that you want to see this content.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really care, to be candid with you. Like, obviously, I am paid to be here, so that's my excuse. No, but in all seriousness, like, this is how it works for MMA media sites. Like, they have vast access to analytical software that shows them what works, and it shows them what works from where the traffic is coming from. Is it coming from social? Is it coming from search? How often are they staying? Are they clicking through other things? What's the overall size of the audience? Is it male? Is it female? How long is the time on site? Like, the amount of metrics that your editor, and probably you to an extent, like, do you use Chartbeat every day?
Yeah, we have similar, things like that.
So, like, things like Chartbeat and Google Analytics and everything else, like, this gives you a vast insight into what works for your audience. Folks, if it didn't work for the audience, he wouldn't be. It's just as simple as that. Like, there's a vast demand for it. What I will say, though, is the question is sort of twofold. One, demand from who? Hardcores or demand from casual audiences? The problem is, of course, we all know the largest audience in combat sports is not hardcores, it is casuals. They come and they go, but as a group, they are much bigger. So they're going to have a lot of say over what kinds of stuff gets produced. And the other part, though, I will say, to defend the fans a little bit, yes, there is obviously, in this particular case, a giant financial incentive to be here, given what the traffic is showing. On the other hand, I do push back on editors a little bit. Not that I'm saying that your editor is doing this, but I'm just sort of saying as a general rule, just giving the audience what the metric says they want doesn't produce the best content. Actually giving them a little bit of a mix is even if they don't necessarily like respond to it the same way, is going to give you a better site. But that is just sort of a general rule.
Yeah, and I will say, I mean, we have people on site at the UFC event this week. We have someone at PFL. So, like, we are giving you everything. If you don't want to watch this content, there's a ton more stuff out there for you.
Dude, if this fight is not for you, absolutely do not watch. Yeah, it's fine.
Do you think the bubble pops here a little bit if Jake Paul loses, or do you think the rematch could have just as much interest? Obviously, it depends how the fight goes, but is this something that only lasts as long as Jake Paul continues to win?
More or less. Kimbo Slice was able to kind of pivot around to different things. He did, obviously, like once he started doing MMA and then the whole Seth Petrozelli thing, you thought there was going to be a bubble, and there was. But what you kind of realized with him over time, and that was a little bit different, a little bit longer, different era of MMA, but what you realized over time was that like personalities like that, like the passions for them die very hard. So then he went and did boxing for a while, and that worked for a little bit, not really with Gary Shaw, and then it kind of failed. And then he did Ultimate Fighter, and it was this total rebirth. Like, so for example, if Jake Paul loses to Tyron, but this is something, again, Brian Campbell had brought up to me, what if what if UFC decides to go into business with him and do some Zuffa boxing on that level against somebody? Like, am I to believe that that would do poorly, or that they couldn't resuscitate him in some kind of way should that be necessary? Of course I believe that they could do that. So, yes, I think obviously if he's winning, things go better. But again, if he loses, there's going to be a rematch. And I'll say this, if he loses and it's like thrilling, which is a little hard for me to believe it'll be thrilling, but let's say very exciting, one never knows. So, I mean, there's an audience of Jake Paul fans that are completely divorced from MMA fans that, like, understand what Jake Paul is doing here. He's trying to convert MMA fans. He's trying to convert boxing fans. He's already got a whole fan base. Are they just going to quit on him because of one loss? I am very skeptical of that.
Yeah, and obviously you want to save maybe the in-depth analysis for your shows, everything like that. But I guess just quickly, like, what do you think this fight looks like? Is it just too hard to predict? What do you think we're ultimately going to see in there Sunday night?
Yeah, it's extremely difficult to predict. I mean, I think, again, this the way in which it was set up is Jake Paul selected Tyron Woodley for a reason. And again, his team could get that wrong, but I tend to think they probably did it for he's been owed a step up in competition for a while, and I think they thought this would be the best one. So, like, basically for that reason, I'm going to side with him. But there is, I mean, a part of me, like, it was honestly like a little hard for me to hear, like, Tyron, like, if you wanted to say the end of Tyron Woodley's career didn't go well in UFC, like, what could you say to the contrary? Yeah, it didn't go well. But, like, the slander of his career during this whole time, like, dude, Tyron is one of the best welterweight champions ever, and that's like one of the best divisions ever. And like
he may have lost to the best four guys currently in the world right now.
Like he wasn't losing to hoes, man. He was losing to good fighters, very good fighters. So to me, it's been a little hard to watch that, to be honest. And maybe that has engendered in me a little bit of a feeling of like, I don't know, man, are we kind of sleeping on Tyron? How many times have we seen guys have 4-fight losing streaks in MMA and then turn it right around? But of course, this is not MMA; it's boxing. And so there's just, the cynicism in me tells me this is probably the Jake Paul show that Tyron got invited to. But I think it'd be foolish to completely dismiss Tyron.
As he said, he was the chosen one. He got chose for this fight. But I'm kind of concerned what the feedback on Tyron Woodley will be if he loses this fight. Definitively he gets knocked out early.
Yeah, I mean, if he loses, and let's say it's like really one-sided, I can't imagine there's going to be another opportunity for this. Although Hector Lombard's looking for that smoke, it appears, in BKFC. So. I'm sure I don't have to tell Dave Feldman how to do his job, but that seems like there might be something for that. But this kind of thing, like boxing or whatever, it would go away.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I won't take up any more of your time. I appreciate Brian Campbell, the superior half of Morning Kombat, giving me his seat here. I won't try to get too comfortable here, but I appreciate your guys' time and having me on the set. And thank you, Luke.
Thank you. I appreciate it.